Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Shubh, and welcome back to another episode. We're going to start by talking about films on planes. Now, as I've mentioned earlier on this podcast, the first time I ever saw a movie was as a baby in my mother's lap, allegedly, on a plane. So, you can understand that planes have had a great sort of level of inspiration in my life in terms of film. Most of the times as a kid, suffering through long flights, you usually end up easing that suffering with a film because that's just the era we grew up in. I used to get bothered by the fact that there were flights that didn't have TVs on them for us to watch a movie. But anyway, I bring this up because the 4 movies that we're going to talk about today are movies that I watched on my plane ride back to New York. So over 24 hours of travel, so you can imagine quite a few movies. But I rounded it down to the top 4, mainly because these are the 4 that I didn't rewatch from, the classic plane movies like Die Hard or the Harry Potter series. Anyway, these are the movies. So the first one we're going to talk about is Greed. It's a British movie, very good satire. Then we move on to Downhill, which is a black comedy remake of a Swedish film starring Will Ferrell and Julia Louis-Dreyfus. Followed by that, we're going to discuss Table 19, starring Anna Kendrick. And finally, we'll discuss Seth Rogen's latest, An American Pickle. Now, albeit I didn't watch this movie on the plane. I watched this when I got back. But even that had a special celebration to it, let's say. But we'll save that for the last segment today. Anyway, let's get started with the first movie, and that is Greed. Now, Greed tells the story of a self-made British billionaire, Sir Richard Macready, whose retail empire is in crisis. For 30 years, he's ruled the world of retail fashion, bringing High Street to the catwalk, and the catwalk to High Street. Just like the CEO of Zara would. But after a damaging public inquiry, similar to what's going on with big tech and stuff right now, his image is tarnished, and to save his reputation, he has to bounce back, and he chooses to do so with a very publicized and huge party celebrating his 60th birthday in Mykonos. Now, Greed is a movie, let's say it sort of ties down the lifestyle of the uber wealthy to the symbol of like a magic trick. There's a case to be made that this movie's humor and characters and sort of level of headiness, let's say, can only be made for an audience that it's trying to satirize. It appeals to an audience that is benefiting from the system that allows 28 people to have more money than almost half of the world's population towards the lower economic end. It's obvious that's the point, and how we understand that this is a system that allows companies like H&M to sell a pair of jeans for like $25 because there are women in countries like Sri Lanka or Bangladesh that are not getting a living wage, a livable wage. But, it's hard to connect the dots when we go into a store and see that, the jeans that you saw in some designer store are basically available for 1/10 of the price. It's a movie for us to see and hold up a mirror against us. The main question of the film is, how do you force someone to look at something that they see every day, and to what end is that of any use? The film's main character, I don't want to say protagonist, is Rich McCready. He's a great character, and the director and writer Michael Winterbottom, he brings out the best in Steve Coogan, who plays him. Steve Coogan's comedic timing and his physicality, every single line that he delivers, make this larger-than-life character so funny. But Greed, it's not the sum of its best parts, because most of the other characters, their actors, they can't pull off the movie's sort of balance between humor and drama, I guess. This is a movie that you get when intelligent people and people who are righteously angry about something make a movie that's a black comedy about late capitalism. Greed, it's fun, despite its sort of sympathetic criticisms of a classless business tycoon like Sir Richard McCready. And can we talk about the fact that his name is Rich McGreedy? But Richard McGreedy is a character based on a real-life billionaire by the name of Philip Green. And Coogan, as always, he has a scene-stealing performance. He has a movie-stealing performance, really. And most of his performances are like nuanced and funny enough to land the points that the director is trying to make. But as I said, the other actors really didn't live up to that mark. There's scenes like Coogan dismissing, let's say, inconveniently located refugees with the wave of his hand and, the uncomfortable stammering. He dismisses a Rod Stewart lookalike as Stewart's bitter brother, and realizes that George Michael is dead, so his double can't be at the party. A very funny scene. And this is a guy whose entire family can quote the movie Gladiator at any point. McCready's, one of his only moments of pride is when he listens to one of the lines that his son says in a flashback and says, "I didn't teach him that. I don't think that's even in the film." But even Coogan can't save this entire movie, of course. Especially the last soliloquy, this like monologue that he delivers before, let's say, in the face of death. And he delivers it brilliantly, but again, Winterbottom then just adds like what Big Short tried to do with the statistics at the end. It didn't work. It felt PowerPointy. It felt like a deck that you deliver at one of these corporate functions. There's a character, Amanda. She seems to be the moral compass of the film. She's a young British Sri Lankan who does this unspecified job for Richard, probably in the party planning committee. And she's the only one who's different. She seems immune to his like attractive aura, let's say, and there's depth to her mixed feelings about Richard and his business practices. Greed isn't really that funny to justify a lot of the shallow caricatures of characters that it has, but there's a climactic party sequence where Amanda takes center stage, and it's such a brilliant storm of like this preposterous display of wealth and stupidness that it manages to blur the line between there's a line that he says in the movie, magic and tragic. And it shows what sort of lies as the anxiety in these oligarchs that we don't often see. But a lot of this movie didn't work for me. You know, the Rich McGreedy thing, like I said, that it's funny, but it's like low-hanging fruit, let's say. The whole character of Nick, this sort of weirdly plotted movie is a result of the fact that Richard's biographer, this sort of weird classicist journalist called Nick, is there to document the event and interview attendees. You know, the character himself, you don't expect this person to be able to write an interesting and riveting book on any subject, even something as blatant as Richard's lifestyle. You know, he only realizes McCready's disgustingness in terms of practices when he conducts research, but even then his crisis of conscience doesn't come until very, very, very late in the film. And the opposite is true for McCready. You know, his character comes off as someone who is definitely not a real person, is definitely one-dimensional in the sense that he just walks around with one attitude, that he knows that his money talks and can get him out of any situation. But Nick, you know, he's such a pushover that even despite being hired as a biographer, he was also made to go to these sweatshops that Rich owns and get the women there to wish Rich happy birthday. The actor, I forget his name, but he's very good at playing this sort of spineless loser character, you know. So it's hard to dismiss his character as just like a very bad media satire. But there's a lot of truth to most scenes where he sort of puffs out his chest and starts delivering some form of classicist or like Shakespearean reference. You know, I guess the metaphor there is like that he's the Greek tragedy that this film sort of ends up becoming. But Winterbottom, he doesn't make full use of this. You know, Greed is a satire. It's supposed to be this like great man narrative, and it's supposed to have it has these like tastefully lit and really nice wide angle master shots, but Nick's investigations add a like sort of sad aspect to it, so it becomes a different movie altogether. There's an inconsistency in tone that sort of breaks the movie for me here. You know, the makers of Greed, they're pretty much in their own way, let's say, to let what Steve Coogan's character and the sort of great man Barty narrative was saying for itself. You know, the film, its tone and its narrative focus, they jump from here to there, and it's a fragmented plot. And that's a shame, because, you know, most of the contributors in this film, like Isla Fisher, is in this. It's pretty good, but it lacks focus. You know, most of this movie is clever, it's true, but it's not. It lacks the depth to resonate beyond, you know, just the watching experience. It's a very forgettable film in that sense, which makes it perfect for a plane ride. Anyway, let's end the segment here. We'll be back to talk about the new Will Ferrell, I don't know how new it is actually, the Will Ferrell and Julia Louis-Dreyfus movie, Downhill.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Alright, welcome back. We just spoke about Greed, a British movie starring Steve Coogan by Michael Winterbottom. But let's talk about the next movie, which is Downhill, starring Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Will Ferrell. So this movie's basically about this family that barely escapes this controlled avalanche during a ski vacation in the Alps. And they're immediately thrown into disarray and sort of forced to reevaluate their lives and how they feel about each other. You know, early in their stay in this luxurious resort, they meet this, for lack of a better term, horny Eurotrash caricature of a concierge played by Miranda Otto. You know, when Pete and Billy, Will Ferrell and Julia Louis-Dreyfus's characters experience something that as like traumatizing as a controlled avalanche where you feel like you're gonna die basically. Pete flees his family, grabs his phone and leaves Billy with his kids. And later, you know, he denies and downplays all of this. And Billy sees. He basically just gaslights her. Now this is a remake of a Swedish movie called Force Majeure. Every movie, even a remake, deserves to be viewed on its own merits. But, you know, when you have a movie like this, which is just such a classically inferior American knockoff of something that's actually good in its original language, it's easier said than done. You know, this project had potential. It's the first time Will Ferrell and Julia Louis-Dreyfus have worked together. You know, the writing and directing duo Jim Rash and Nat Faxon, they made this incredible movie called The Way, Way Back. And they're working with a writer from Succession, Jesse Armstrong, and Succession right now is the best show on television. Except Perry Mason. Perry Mason is also very good. Both HBO. But with all of this talent on hand, you know, it's a letdown to see a movie that lacks edge. And it's a depiction of a marriage dealing with disaster, but they try to broaden the audience by making it cheap comedy, honestly. The moment where Pete splits, it's this sort of split-second unthinking decision, and it reveals this huge flaw in his character. And this is like a truly incredible way to introduce the problems that exist in this marriage and establish both the characters themselves. But Faxon and Rash, and Jesse Armstrong, they didn't have the imagination to take this idea from the original and make it their own, you know, or even make it work with just like some comedy legends. There's jokey parts, there's like parts where you cry, there's a nice sexy moment, there's a few displays of anger that are actually really well performed by Julia Louis-Dreyfus, but it's all just thrown together and it feels like a snack mix of a movie in that way. You know, Bong Joon-ho, when he won the Golden Globe, he delivered a very strong message. Once you overcome the 1-inch tall barrier of subtitles, we will be introduced to so many more amazing films. You know, it's a lesson that any fan knows and has learned with the success of Parasite. But I wish Nate Faxon, Jim Rash, and everyone involved in this film had just let it be what it was, and not remade what is actually an incredible film in Force Majeure. But you know, that being said, it's clear that they really love this film. By they, I mean the directors. You know, they don't even move the action of the film to an American location. It still takes place at an Alps resort. And to be honest, they both look the exact same. But there are some twists, you know, and some of them worked. The Miranda Otto character, the concierge, her character is completely new. But there's also, you know, scenes like the whole #millennial thing that is just an overplayed BuzzFeed type of joke. But mostly, you know, these filmmakers, they didn't find tonal balance. You know, there was a floppy film that sort of went to like typical studio broad appeal humor to like a really deep drama, and it didn't find the medium that it should have treaded on. You know, this inciting incident that we spoke about, it's clever. It's pretty much, as I said, the gateway to establishing both the characters. But this film shot it in pretty much the identical manner as the original. And then, as with the original, the film sort of reaches a boiling point later in the film. But they shortened a few big sequences from the original. But both films also have this incredible revelation scene where Billy and Pete sort of go at it while their friends are watching. You know, there's also scenes like where Julia Louis-Dreyfus gets mad when an attempt at heli skiing is ill-fated. And in these scenes, she can be hilarious and horrifying. And that establishes what downhill could be. But at the end of the day, the best way of this film to be, you know, shown is already out there in Force Majeure. I suppose the thing that bothers me the most is Faxon and Rasher's inability to capture that sharp and zinging tone of the original movie. You know, it tiptoed the line between comedy and drama without ever forgetting the power of the other in one. There's moments of great humor in Downhill, you know. When you have Will Ferrell, Zach Woods, Julia Louis-Dreyfus in a film, you're gonna get humor. But nothing ever gels together quite in a way that Force Majeure did. Even then, you know, these actors were also very underused. For Farrell, this is a movie that could have taken more advantage of his sort of drama-leaning talents, but instead it casts him in a way that you always see that sort of man-child type of character that he plays. You know, this is a man whose maturity is being set back in a way that he's always been the way he is. And he needs to learn to take responsibility for his family and his responsibilities, I suppose. But this movie takes that and makes it an immature man-child. At least Julia Louis-Dreyfus was given richer material. You know, she goes from disturbed to very disgusted. And it's all very clearly visualized. She realizes that she deserves better than Pete and his passiveness and sort of checked outness from his life, and has incredible sort of comebacks in dialogue whenever Pete tries to deflect or deny what happened with the avalanche. You know, in one of the most funny scenes, she asserts her autonomy during her time with the ski instructor, Guillermo. Her actions are surprising, obviously, but they make her character so much more interesting than her husband, who's pretty much just a one-dimensional, bland person. Like a lot of sort of broad-reaching comedies, Downhill, it's afraid of something that it could be. You know, there's a thought that swearing and drug references might disguise, you know, a panic about parenthood, about family, about work, about sexual politics, or anything else that might be interesting or risky. But this film, it's not sure whether to take which side, Pete's or Billy's, you know, or if it should even take a side. So it just like hovers there, and we watch with a completely objective eye. But at least there's Julia Louis-Dreyfus, you know. She bridges the yawnable moments with her stellar performance. Anyway, that was Downhill. Up next, we have Table 19, followed by An American Pickle. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. We spoke about Downhill just now. Up next is Table 19. Now, Table 19 was the first movie I watched on the plane, mostly because I just finished watching HBO Max's Love Life. There it is, HBO again. This was not at par with the usual HBO quality, to be honest, because it sucked. But, it's one of those shows that you just keep watching because you want to know how it ends. Kept the mystery alive. That's about it. Anyway, in that is Anna Kendrick, and I saw Anna Kendrick in this movie, and I thought, might as well give it a try. I want to see what the range is here. Anyway, so this film is about an ex-maid of honor, Eloise, who is relieved of her duties after being dumped by the best man, who is the bride's brother, by text. Usually what normal people would do is not go to this wedding, but Eloise, played by Anna Kendrick, held her head high and attended this wedding regardless. Because of this, she finds herself seated at a table in the back of the ballroom with sort of breakfast clubby group of strangers. Most of them who definitely should have just said no at the on the RSVP. Anyway, over the 80 minutes that this movie runs for, the secrets of all the characters are revealed, and Eloise learns a few things from the people of Table 19. It's basically Breakfast Club at a wedding. This type of movie might be cheap to make, but no other genre of movie has a smaller sort of margin of error. The good ones are incredible, but the bad ones make you want to leave the theater. And to be honest, Table 19 is one of those sort of movies that misses the mark. You kind of don't want to sit through it. But, I was trapped in a steel cage for about 13 hours at this point, so I figured might as well. The movie opens quite poorly with these really uninspired character introductions that it just make it really sort of unbelievable of the sort of main premise of the film. Anna Kendrick at this point has mastered this art of playing this type of girlfriend that is forced to suffer through someone else's wedding. She did it in Love Life. She's doing it here. I should say she did it in Love Life, and then now she did it in this, and now she's doing it in Love Life. Actually, chronologically, that makes the most sense. But she's the first person we meet in this film, and pretty much the only one that we get to know, because it seems like her problems matter more than anyone else's. And one of them is dying of cancer. With the opening sort of introduction to her, we see her agonizing over whether or not she RSVPs. She checks a box, and then she sets the paper on fire in a fit of frustration, and then eventually sends back a half-burnt RSVP saying yes. And that's why she's sat at table 19, where the misfit table, the one that's located closer to the bathroom than the dance floor. Yeah, and then one by one we meet the other unfortunate people that are sitting with her. There's Stephen Merchant's Walter, who is a convict, down on his luck, trying to enjoy sort of a break from prison life. There's Renzo, played by Tony Revolori. Probably the best acting in this film, to be honest. He's a horny teenage virgin, again, for lack of a better term, and wears a sort of furry bow tie and has no real reason for being in the wedding, to be honest. There's Joe Flanagan, the first nanny of the bride. Her presence gives the film a sense of melancholy that I don't think it needs. And then there's Bina and Jerry Cap, Lisa Kudrow and Craig Robinson, two great comedic actors. They play a married couple who own a diner in Columbus and are having marital issues. Unlike the rest of the characters, except maybe Renzo, Bina and Jerry are the most charming in this film. They have a comfortable chemistry. They're exactly like everyone else, though. Their stories are stunted. They're confused. They don't make sense. They're uninteresting. I mean, see, Table 19 starts off as an uncomfortable experience. And that's not just because these characters are in an uncomfortable situation. The film itself, it puts you on edge in a very subliminal manner. Like, you don't know anyone in this wedding party beyond the minimal facts that you're given. You barely even see the bride and groom till the end, to be honest. And the movie doesn't bother with exposition. It doesn't just find ways to explain what's going on and what just happened. It's because the movie's director and co-writer, Jeffrey Blitz, he sort of rewrote an initial draft by the brothers Duplass, Jay and Mark. He tends to keep the camera with the people at the table, observing everyone else from their perspective. You feel just as isolated as they do because you can't see the rest of the party. The whole movie is intentionally very awkward. And that added layer of discomfort, it comes from watching, if you've signed on to watch like a full-length movie of people just watching from the back. But at a certain point in this film, again, these characters get away from that prison and that deadlock. And from there, the movie becomes something better. It becomes the Breakfast Club sort of idea that I was alluding to about characters who, when thrown together in an unfamiliar and sort of prison-like context, find that new experience and opening up allows them to deal with emotional issues that they've been avoiding addressing for a long time. Everyone at this table has a secret, and these secrets are revealed often with interactions with these new people they've just met. The best part of the film is the middle, where the characters sort of just disappear and wander off on their own and forget about the reception that they came to attend. There's something nice about this portion of the story. The film, it gets up from that table itself and says, I've had enough of that. I want to get out of here. I want to clear my head. The movie also appears to set up these subplots that you expect to resolve. There's flirtation between Eloise and a handsome stranger named Huck. And then Huck disappears till the very end in a very anticlimactic way. But the worst of all, the movie also feels like it needs to be a romantic comedy, where everything ends well. And this is the biggest failing point for the film, for me. It's a intriguing film based on the choices that it makes, and some of these are incredible, like the feeling of trappedness in the beginning. But at a general level, again, the same happened with Downhill. When you try to pander, when you try to be more broad and inclusive, you just tend to alienate the audience. It tries to satisfy the conventional requirements of a Hollywood rom-com, in that everything at the end sort of gets tied up very neatly, and make sure it's forced or unbelievable completely. The movie has emotional epiphanies that it tries to claim, but it just doesn't work because it's built on a flimsy foundation. Everything that happens in the middle part is believable. There's that first section which is bold, but Table 19, it's kind-hearted and pivots to become the kind of film that it seemed to be an alternative to, but eventually ends up being just another one of those. And, okay, let's see. The reception, setting in this film is not believable whatsoever. The people on this table we don't get to see them in the actual ceremony. These people feel so distant from all the action that it's like the party isn't happening. They're on the periphery. And I guess that's the point I was trying to make, but it doesn't really land. He does land some punchlines, but these decent jokes here and there just call further attention to the film's lack of rhythm, because they come at just the weirdest times. Table 19, it tries to go between broad comedy and sort of quirky Sundance type of movie with every scene, and because of that, it doesn't really find its grasp. It's again, like Downhill, sort of unsure of what it's trying to be, and I guess that also makes it a perfect Blaine movie. There's a moment where all of these characters smoke weed and start falling over, because that's the kind of movie it is. This is the introduction of the wedding cake, which is introduced as, the obvious throwaway gag with a wedding cake at a wedding comedy would be, and involving a cake at least. I'm going to let you figure that one out. But it's worth seeing for the performances. In particular, Stephen Merchant. Not all the performances, but Lisa Kudrow, Stephen Merchant, Renzo. But Stephen Merchant has that classic deadpan delivery that is still incredible. Anyway, stay tuned, because up next we're going to talk about An American Pickle.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
And welcome back to our final segment. We just spoke about Downhill, Table 19, and Greed. Now we're going to talk about An American Pickle. Now this is the only movie from the four that I didn't see on a plane, mostly because it came out on the day I was flying. But it's the first movie I watched when I got back to my place in New York. Now, the difference between my place in Singapore and with my parents is that, I don't have access to most streaming services, and also I don't have a TV that I can, watch those things on in my room. Here, I have a TV in my room. And let me tell you, watching a movie or any form of sort of filmmaking or visual storytelling is so much better on a TV than a laptop. Obviously, it's nothing compared to a cinema. But it's just nicer, when you have a bigger screen like that. So I'm kind of happy that this is the movie that I ended up watching first. Anyway, so this movie is about an immigrant worker who falls into a vat of pickles in the 1900s and is brined for 100 years. The pickle brine preserves him perfectly, and 100 years later he emerges in present-day Brooklyn to find he hasn't aged a single day. Now, imagine falling asleep in Brooklyn and waking up 100 years later to find everything completely different. How would you survive? What weird, quirky hipster profession would you sort of pursue? I'd be a barista. And most important, what would you think of your modern day descendants? And that's the premise of this movie, but also the novella that it was based on, called Sellout by Simon Rich. I've been reading a bunch of Simon Rich's stuff, mostly because I just finished Man Seeking Woman, and it's a great show. I highly recommend anyone watch it. It's a very clever show. Simon Rich is probably one of the funniest humorists alive right now. Anyway, so this novella, Sellout, it appeared for the first time in The New Yorker in 2013 and is now been adapted to this film. It features Seth Rogen, and the screenplay was adapted by Simon Rich. The story centers on Herschel Greenbaum, who, as I said, falls into a giant vat of pickle brine and is preserved for 100 years. But the twist isn't the time travel, but in fact, when Herschel awakens, he encounters his great-grandson, who personifies all of these bourgeois hipster qualities that go completely against his own early 1900s attitude. During their first meeting, Ben says to Herschel, "How about Thai fusion? This place has amazing gluten-free ginger thingies." That disconnect is what makes this movie funny. It's these interactions between Herschel and his descendant that provide the movie this off-center humor. Simon Rich, he began contributing to The New Yorker in 2007 and published 30 pieces. One of my favorites is Guy Walks Into a Bar. Simon Rich, he was one of the youngest ever writers hired on Saturday Night Live. He was the chair of the Harvard Lampoon. He wrote at SNL for 4 years, and then he joined Pixar as a staff writer. He's published 9 books, including Hits and Misses, which is the one that I just finished. And he's the creator of TV shows like Man Seeking Woman and Miracle Workers. Miracle Workers is also another great show, but only the first season. Wasn't a big fan of the second. Anyway, he began writing the story that this movie was based on when he was 27, working at Pixar. And he said that the movie was born out of sort of self-loathing. He talked about how his ancestors were Eastern European Jews who immigrated to the U.S. to escape from oppression and poverty. In contrast, I suppose his life has just been outrageously privileged and easy. He said that his great-grandparents probably endured more in one day than he would in his entire life. And that's what this movie sort of starts off as. When Herschel encounters his great-great-grandson, I think, he's baffled by the new sort of nonchalant approach towards life, and especially faith. It's the battle between the secular Jew and the traditional Jew. Simon Rich talks a lot about Judaism in a lot of his works, because he said that he's lost so much in so many aspects of his heritage, and that he would be seen as immoral or frivolous or superfluous, let's say, if he met one of his ancestors. And, that's part of the appeal of this story. It's how Rich subverts these expectations so that, the viewer, they identify with the old school Herschel, the old-fashioned Herschel even, more than his modern descendant. Obviously screenwriting is different from writing prose, especially humoristic prose. But Simon Rich has done both. He was surprised that his very idiosyncratic and esoteric subjects were finding an audience when he first started writing for The New Yorker. He said that his stories were irrelevant, and the fact that The New Yorker let him publish these stories about, a talking condom or a lovesick caveman, it's incredible to him. The magazine obviously has a long history of publishing idiosyncratic humor, when you think of people like James Thurber, especially in the early days. But Simon Rich has this offbeat, unsettling quality to his humor that it sort of feels like, you go for a walk one day and then get lost, but pleasantly so. Obviously, a premise can translate well from page to screen, but other than that, you have to really start from scratch. You just take the essence of the book and sort of apply it to its own different structure, because they're very different narrative mediums. And in that way, a lot of the visual language for this film worked for me. The opening scene, the expository material, the way they got that message across, it's marvelous. The first part is shot in this sort of boxy, old-fashioned aspect ratio, and it has these very old-timey, delicate colors, and even sort of filmmaking techniques. It feels like a movie that you would actually see from that time. And this is where Seth Rogen comes in with his broken English in a very funny Yiddish accent. Seth Rogen as Herschel narrates the dramatic history of his young adulthood, beginning with the shtetl life of Eastern European Jews in 1919 in this town of Slupsk. It's the type of place where, to court a woman, you could do the obvious romantic gesture of buying a smoked fish and watch her eat its head off. And that's what happens to Herschel. He gets married to Sarah, and right as their wedding is finished, a group of Cossacks comes in and murders and sets fire to their entire township. So they go to America and search for an American dream, only for Herschel obviously to fall in a pat of pickle brine. Really what makes this film is Seth Rogen's performance. Seth Rogen, he's not the first person you think of when you think actor. He's not a Meryl Streep with accents. He's not like a Daniel Day-Lewis method acting. Well, he might be, but he's not really perceived as one. But, he has this incredible grasp on Herschel, and the aura that emanates from what a man who would be preserved for 100 years would feel like when they entered a world that is completely beyond one of their understanding. And he gets it, because this man is supposed to represent that sort of old ancestor of the current Jewish American subconscious. He wears this cap with the wool clothes and the mud-stained boots and that huge beard with the constant threats of doing violence. But Rogen also gets his other character, Ben, because Rogen is Ben with a little bit more money. Rogen makes these huge Hollywood films and does voices for cartoons. He lives in a big house. He has everything: soft bed, air conditioner, fridge. He drives a horseless carriage, let's say. Although I feel like his Ferraris, if he has any, have horses on them. And he's a great Twitter person. The film, it feels like something you'd write as a successful writer who feels like they have sort of imposter syndrome because their ancestors did hard manual labor and all they do is come up with ideas and write them down. I know how hard writing is. It's not that easy, but still, that's the character Ben. That's the character Ben is. He's at his best when he faces off against himself. Obviously, we know that you can't have two Seth Rogans talking to each other, and that's movie magic. But it feels like there are two Seth Rogans talking to each other in this film. There's also this awareness of self-loathing, like I said, with something that's deeply rooted in culture. But these scenes have incredible respect for the journey that it takes for Herschel to become Ben. Well, mostly. At its best, An American Pickle, it's a clever movie with accessible sort of messaging about Jewish manhood and masculinity. But the good parts are so distinctive compared to the bad parts that are so forgettable. And that makes the movie frustrating to watch because it's a funny movie and it's a good movie, but you just wish there was more to it. But even then, the movie, it avoids talking about the most alarming aspect of Jewish persecution between Herschel's time and now, the Holocaust. And Herschel, or any of the characters, don't even make a single sort of passing remark about it. The closest it comes to acknowledging the realities of what a Jewish struggle is comes from this passing exchange between Herschel and Ben, where they both realize that they endure some form of hard times. Herschel says, if one thing is true in America, once you say terrible things, you'll never be a success. And Ben says that's definitely not true at all. But if American Pickle had the nerve to go deeper or even darker into that sentiment, it might have, warranted the complexity of the performance that Seth Rogen delivered for itself. But it's enjoyable enough to watch, Seth Rogen carry this movie single-handedly, mirrored on a split screen. He carries this high concept. It's also easy to understand why a big studio would pass this off to a streamer, because this movie is not necessarily very easy to market. Obviously also, theaters aren't very open right now. I'm gonna miss being in Singapore for that. I can't go to the theaters here. I really wish I could. But anyway, it's the type of movie you want to watch that makes sort of sense of the challenges of the climate of today that we're also facing. Herschel might not know what he's doing, but his commitment and his work ethic are consistent. And he's, the embodiment of persevering through impossible odds. It's a story about moving forward and showing a little chutzpah, and that's what Herschel exemplifies. Anyway, with that, thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you've enjoyed the show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. You can also follow us on Twitter at GSMC_movies. Thank you for listening. This has been Shubh Nanda, and well, take care.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.